Hello, everybody, and welcome to Co.Lore, the company lore podcast. I'm your host, as always, Mark Coxon, the AV Phenom. And today I'm really excited. I don't know how, I was able to pull an amazing guest for the podcast today. Today we're going to be talking to Carlos Carrasquillo, and Carlos is a principal and partner in Wolcott Architecture. How are you doing, Carlos?
Good. Good to be with you.
Awesome, man. I'm excited. I mean, after this last year and a half, I even took kind of a hiatus on this, even though it's a virtual podcast. And so I'm excited to get back in the groove and start seeing people face to face, even if it's through the computer.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a wild ride to say the least, right?
For sure. And I wanted to have you on because I think, a lot of people out there are there's a lot of chatter out there in the world right now about space and how we're going to use space. And so I really wanted to get somebody from the architecture community who's well known and whose work I know somewhat just through my dealings out here in Los Angeles, to come on and just talk to us a little bit. Number one, about architecture in general, but maybe somewhere where we see things are going and things of that nature. So first off, I mean, I always like to get people's origin stories. It's always good to hear like how people connected to this passion. How did you connect to the world of design and architecture?
So, like everyone, I have this long journey of how you get from A to B, right? So, growing up, I'm actually a military brat. My father was in the U.S. Army. I was born into it, graduated high school in it. So, I was lucky enough as a young individual to travel throughout the world. Was born in Texas, a Puerto Rican, so I would always go back to Puerto Rico, the Caribbean. Lived in Germany, lived in Panama, lived in Washington D.C. So I was lucky enough, like I said, to travel around the world and to see different things and to see how different people kind of go about living their lives based on the environment that they were fortunate enough to live in. So I always thought that was interesting, right? Like if you look at European cities, how they're very plaza based and everything feels customized for the pedestrian versus the automobile. But when I'd come back to the US, it was kind of the reverse. Everything seemed like the car really led the charge on how a lot of these places developed. And then to even like Puerto Rico, where it's a lot smaller, it's a very small island, has an island feel to it. But there are very heavy European influences, like in the old districts, like old San Juan, is very Spanish in nature, and the cobblestone roads. It's impossible to get a car up into certain areas. Making turns is tough. So that's always intrigued me, right? How each of these people live totally different ways just based on their environment. So that always kind of in the back of my head was like, wow, I wonder who controls how that operates and how you go about doing that. Now, I've always had a bit of what I'd call like an art flair in my background. So, growing up, it was like I wanted to do something in the arts, whether that was like graphic design, whether at one point it was like wanting to do graffiti, which when I was young, it wasn't, you couldn't really make a living off of that. Now, if I were to have been born a bit later, you can actually make a living off of doing graffiti and street art. And just out of happenstance, it was like, okay, well, architecture and architects seem to make money to a certain extent, right? Where they're not rich, but they're not living out of vans either, right? They
Yeah.
seem to do art and sculpture and people that live in that world of being creative. Why not try that? So I tried it in college. I started school in Puerto Rico, and I actually graduated from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So in Puerto Rico, I was fortunate enough to have a program literally start an architecture program start 1 year when I was into that school. And then I just tested the water out, loved it, and have been doing it ever since. Never wavered one way or the other. Just found it second year in college, and that's all she wrote.
Wow. That's amazing. That's a really cool journey. I often say that, observation is kind of the unlock to some of the passions and the unique viewpoints that we have, right? And that
Mm-hmm.
whole idea of living in all these places and starting to watch how people live and
Yeah.
letting that kind of spark this passion for wow, is there something to, does the environment drive some of the culture, or does the culture drive the environment? I mean, that interplay must be really interesting.
Yeah, like all things, right? It's a little bit of both, right? Because it's really hard to not let certain buildings influence, or certain clusters of buildings and how they're positioned influence how you interact with them, right? But when it's done properly, and you actually craft the experience and you're trying to get something out of the experience, that's really when it sings, from my perspective, right? Like when it's a very intentional, I want people to interact with the space and use it in this fashion. I think that's where you get the most success out of what we do for a living. And I think the U.S. has done a lot better as of late. But I think that the old European cities really did cater to the human being, and not so much of all of these outside sources. So I mean, I say this as someone that's lived on this side of the world predominantly. I won't speak for Europeans because I'm sure some of them love coming out here in the openness and like the total lack of density at times, right? You see that a lot. But the grass is always greener, right? So for
Yeah.
me, I always think of going to places like Europe and Italy and Greece and all those, and it's just kind of a magical experience because you feel like that the scale of that building is meant for me, right? Like I'm 5'10", you know. I don't feel like like insignificant when I come across this thing. Like the way it's articulated, I corresponds to my sense of scale. Where and I'm not downplaying like our skyscrapers and such because they're amazing engineering feats, but there is something distinct when you walk next to a skyscraper versus when you walk next to like a 3-story building that is like only like 15-foot wide of a walkway. It just feels like, okay, this is meant for a human. It's not meant for to drive by and see it from a distance.
Yeah. No, I could totally see that. I could totally see that. That's funny. Since we're talking about environment and space, and you said, the position of buildings or the way that they're designed can't help but influence the way that people maybe act or interact with each other, or how they, go about behaviorally. It makes me think about, like, with this new, with the new environment as we're going forward, there's this, I saw a stat the other day that 41% of people are looking for a new job. Like
Mhm.
41% of the US are looking for somewhere else to go, which to me says that, like, the connection to our companies has kind of faded in the last year and a half. So even if we've been able to, continue through this virtual world that we're talking through right now, like, this connection to space and an actual entity is kind of faded somewhat. Um, so with that, like, what do you think? What do you think the role of, space, for if you were a company, or if you were a museum, or if you were, if you were a space, what do you think the role of that space in creating connection to people, to employees, is going to be going forward? Do you?
What it's going to be, it's so there's a lot that you just
Sorry,
said.
I am.
Oh, no,
I loaded it up. You can pick to unpack any one little piece of that.
I'm going to try and unpack some of it because there's a lot there, and there's a lot of implications. And I think if you pull on any one of those points you made, I think there it's like a sweater, right? So I'm I like to think of myself as a cynic on a lot of things, right? Like I was born in '75. I grew up in the '80s when I'm total Gen X, where it's part of our makeup, right? Part of how we came up. So I like to challenge everything on a devil's advocate basis. Just I don't know because I can't help myself at times.
Yeah.
Um, so this idea that 40+% of people are looking for something new, attributing that to COVID and what happened and the way we've lived, I think is an easy answer, and it's not that it's the wrong answer, right? Jesus, that makes sense, right? If you say that
Mhm.
out loud. But I'd like to challenge that, in the back of my head and say, okay, was that already happening? Because before this, the economy was like going crazy, right? I mean,
Mhm.
we all lived through it and enjoyed it. And there was a lot of turnover because there was a lot of opportunities that were created. So I absolutely think that COVID has something to do with this, but I'm not sure that that's like the 90% of why this is happening. I think it was just a natural progression of why it was happening. I think that uh, that a lot of what's happened and a lot of the fact that we haven't been able to interact with each other on like a human scale has impacted that? Absolutely. We were so busy that you didn't have time to look around and like look for kinks in the system, right? Look for deficiencies in how a culture is operating for a company. I think the fact that we've had time to sit, I think most of us, our work has not totally dried up, but there's enough lull that you actually have time to think about something other than I have this deadline coming up. So I think a lot of people have started to say, okay, maybe it's a point in my life that maybe I need to look for something else, right? Just because we don't live in the 50s anymore and you don't stay with companies for 30 years. Um, how that relates to space, I think it just punctuates extremely heavy how important space really is, right? Because this idea that we all went through when this first started, which was, oh, it's virtual. We have these incredible, we all have an incredible culture. People are going to stay with us. It doesn't matter if we're virtual. We talk every day. I mean, all of that is faded in the luster of and the novelty of like doing what you and I are doing right now has started to go away. And in my mind, and it's not that it's the right answer yet, but it's I'm like getting to an answer here. Just taking stuff out is that we don't have the physical presence and the place to meet and congregate and to actually push a culture forward, right? Like it feels like these environments that we build really are about getting people together and having an exchange of ideas, like a presence of each other, understanding who each other really are, having casual conversations that aren't programmed and calendared. So I think that's what a physical space really ultimately lets us do, which is be humans, operate the way we've always operated, operate as a community. Whether that space, I think a lot of cities, you see how people naturally congregate where they congregate. I think some of the best spaces are the ones that aren't designed for a particular task. It's that people made them for that task, by just organically doing it, like putting something on Twitter, hey, everyone meet up here. And it's kind of, you're in a mall and you're supposed to shop at the mall, and all of a sudden people are just hanging out at the mall because you made it that, right? So I think it's not only on us as designers to figure out what these spaces really are about and the environment's about. I think it's also about the people that use those spaces to interact, right? You need two people to dance, so to speak. And
Yeah,
I don't know
that's
if that answered the question.
no, yeah. I think
Okay.
I think it totally did. I like your idea that perhaps we were disconnected before, but we just didn't have time to realize it. We were so heavy in production mode, right?
Yeah.
The economy was booming. We're busy every day. We've got more work than we can get off our plate that's going to be there the next day in the morning, that you never really have that time to pause and say, is this really what I want to be doing?
Yeah.
Right. And then with the lull, is it COVID that did it, or is it the time and the realization? And I like that perspective, that it might have just been time and realization, that this might have just been an acceleration of maybe a wanderlust that was already there, but it just gave somebody time to discover it, right?
Yeah.
In a way. I like that idea.
I'd actually be curious too, because I always, I'm a cynic, but whenever someone hits me with the stat, I always want to see behind that stat, right? So I'm curious, out of the 40+%, what the age range is, right? Because I think on a generational basis, let's say if more than 50% are millennial based, then that totally makes sense. And I don't think that's anything totally out of the norm, because I think as a generation, those guys move around a lot. They're very ambitious. If they get anxious about things, all qualities that some people look negative, some others say that they're pushing boundaries. So are the older people, which I'm starting to fall into that older category.
Me
Are
too.
they more stable within that 40%? Those kind of questions I think are very interesting and telling to understand what comes next.
Oh yeah, I 100% agree with you. I love seeing the back end of that data, and unfortunately, I don't have that because I read that in an article and I didn't see the initial study. It was done by Microsoft,
Mm-hmm.
and they were just doing a study on how remote work was affecting people, and it was a pretty interesting study. When you said that, that's funny because I did a presentation with a group called the AV User Group a couple weeks ago, and I started with the slide that was the quote of, there are lies, damned lies, and statistics, right?
Yeah,
Like that stat can be spun any other way, and if you don't know what's behind it, you can misuse it very easily. So I
absolutely.
like that idea. I'll have to do a little digging and figure that out.
Yeah.
Well, your job, I mean, I have seen your work here in LA transition a little bit, but I've seen some of your work and some of your clients and things in here in LA through, a workplace company that I worked with and through friends that I know that have used you guys. Um, you have a very, it seems like a very unique approach to how you help people develop space to give them the best, I guess, the best platform to do their work. How do you have a process, or how do you really get into the unique persona of a company or the unique makeup of their employees and workforce to come up with those ideas on what the best type of space for them to build is?
Yeah. So I think like a lot of firms, right, programming and visioning is critical, right, to really start to dig into who they are as a company. Um, I at a certain point in my career, I started to think of these companies almost as individuals, right? Like every person is different. Every person has very nuanced approach to how they operate, what makes them tick, what they hate, what throws them off, what would function for some, wouldn't function for another. I mean, it's so simple as someone will love a beach, and you talk to someone else and they hate sand and they can't do the beach, right? Like it's I think companies are that different, right? So I think through conversation, through understanding user groups, even these user groups, sometimes have wildly different ideas. So it really is about having conversations with people as much as possible and trying to let them do the talking and just almost sit back and let them argue amongst themselves, so that you can come to some sort of consensus. And I think all of that needs to happen before you even start thinking about design, right? There's that for me is when you're dealing with a user, right? There's a whole other side of the business, which is you're creating the space where users are going to go to, and you're almost doing it on a spec basis. And the mode of operation is totally different at that point, right? We do a lot of adaptive reuse, repositionings, where you're almost crafting the story that you then want people to come and fit into, right? Because you don't have the user, right? You're just building these spaces that hopefully the developers and your client will be able to draw people because there's enough interest. Totally different than like dealing with a user and getting in there and saying, who are you? What is it that you want? And then taking the space and developing it based off of that data.
Yeah, that to me seems like, I like your idea of the very individualized approach to it, because, even in technology, which is the business I'm in, I always like to say, my best tool when I go into a meeting is a blank piece of paper.
Mm-hmm.
Coming in without a preconceived notion of what you want to sell, and instead, listening for what they're trying to do and then working backwards into that solution, which seems like it should be the natural path. But a lot of people get stuck on, their services and their products first, and
Yeah.
then try to shoehorn what the client wants to do into what they already know how to do, right?
Yeah.
It's this kind of push. And so, I appreciate that a lot. Do you do a lot of observation? Like when you were talking about living in the world and all the places you've lived, you talked about the way that you would observe societies and places and cities. When you're doing this programming or envisioning phase, is part of that going to where the company lives and works now and kind of looking at what they're at, where they're at, how they do things, how their people interact, and then finding those gaps and figuring out, hey, if you build a new space, these are the things you should add, or these are the things you should keep? Is that part of the process, some of that observation?
It is. It definitely is. We definitely go there, do studies, look at how they operate. The reality of it though is that in a perfect world, we would do it like 3 times more than we ever get time to, right? Because
Yeah.
a lot of the clients always come to us and the first thing out of their mouth is, I got to be in 2 months. What are you going to do? It's like, well, the process is about a year here, team. Let's try and figure it out. So because it's an industry that that's always money driven and we have to live grounded in schedules and budgets. We do what you're describing, but man, I wish we could do so much more of it. I wish we could get like 3 months just to work out of their space, become one of them for a little bit would be a dream. Like, hey, can you give me a desk? I'm going to sit here. I'm going to go to lunch with your people. I'm going to actually see how the person in charge walks around and interacts. I'm going to see kind of who the alpha in the group is. All of that stuff would be absolutely incredible. So yes, but man, I wish we could do more.
Yeah, I think some of my favorite, when I was in school, I was studying zoology, and I think some of my favorite classes were the animal behavior classes, where we would sit and sometimes we would just watch an hour of like baboons interacting or something and trying to figure out who's who and what the power structure is in a group and things like that. And it was very interesting to just kind of sit and watch and marinate in what was going on, and then come back and be able to put out your theories on it. So I could see that for sure.
Yeah.
Without disclosing a client, because I don't want you to put you on the line for sharing anything you shouldn't share. Thinking about that, can you remember a time where you had enough time to do some of that observation and maybe a key insight you took away from it that you wouldn't have if you didn't
Yeah.
have that time?
I think early in my career, I was fortunate enough to get a project that had a really good schedule, right? Like the client was very knowledgeable, really appreciated the process because they understood the process. It wasn't the first time they did it. And I think that's when it first, like a lot of these things start to click. You do them enough, and then you have these aha moments where you can self-simplify in your head and almost bring it back to a diagram. And one of my first, it wasn't the first, but like on the first ones, it was when it clicked that it was, wow, all of these companies are very different, right? They do the same exact thing. They're pushing out the same exact product, but oh my God, is this different from the last one that we just did? So once you start to actually get the breathing room to think about all of this, that was one of the major insights to me, was that, okay, so this means that every one of these moving forward, that the preconceived idea that you mentioned earlier has to go out the window, right? Because you make a lot of mistakes when you're a young designer. It's like you're always trying to push your vision. You think that you know more than people, and pretty quickly you get grounded in reality, and it's like, you get hit on the chin a couple of times. It's like, okay, maybe I got to calm down. Sitting amongst people helped me calm down and be like, okay, I don't know. I don't have all the answers. I should just shut up and learn about this company and not try and tell them what they are. They're going to tell me.
Yeah, I think we easily fall in love with our own ideas, right? Like and it's hard to emotionally detach from that. And I saw that, or I think early in my career too, where there were things I thought should be done a certain way, and then quickly realized that there were 2 or 3 reasons that they weren't done that way, that I was just too naive to understand yet, right?
Yeah.
So
there's never a right answer, right? It's like as a young person, I think it's a double-edged sword, right? It's good to have the frame of mind to want to be stubborn about stuff, because everyone in our business tells you can't do it. It's just so common that you're always told you can't do things. So that's a good trait to have. But at like, it's a double-edged sword, right? Where you try and push too hard sometimes, and you've got to start to learn where to distinguish between, am I pushing too hard for my own sake, or am I pushing hard enough for theirs, right? And finding that balance is something that I just think as a young individual, you just don't know, and that's okay, right? I mean, that's what people with gray in their beard are around to tell you. Hey, let's calm down on this one. You'll win the battle next time.
yeah, I think that's an interesting point of view. How do you I guess on the flip side of that, not on the flip side, but as an extension of that, sometimes the person telling you, oh, it can't be done that way, may be your client.
Mhm.
How do you I guess constructively challenge them to make sure that they're not reacting to a paradigm or an old kind of position that they've held, as opposed to really thinking through the topic again?
Yeah. And again, I sound like an old guy now, like you young people, right?
Yeah.
Here's what I tell a lot of the young designers I work with, like the more talented ones, or the ones that you really want to dig into, and help them along. I think our process, and I know I said that everyone has a schedule and they're always trying to cram through it. Our process is a very paced out process. There's phases that we all take for granted at this point, but are very instrumental in helping us do certain things, right? So my take is, like in SD, schematic design, our first phase, you don't have to win every battle, right? There's DD, there's CD. So you have to make everyone on the team feel like they're part of the team. You can't be this dictator that sits at the top and instructs people what to do, because one, you're not writing the checks, right? Like this, someone else is writing the check here, so you have to respect that. But what you can do is help them feel like they're part of the process. Some people, including us, sometimes have really bad ideas. You never want to tell someone, hey, that's a horrible idea. Like, no idea is a bad idea. You want to filter out, what the personalization of that idea means, and try and get to its root meaning. And sometimes it's not good, sometimes it is good. You don't have to shoot it down right away.
Yeah.
In DD, the second phase, design development, whatever they said at that point, if it's a really bad idea, you can filter it out. You can gradually get them to see things the way that you think will be better for them. You got to keep in mind that we take for granted what we do because we do it so much, and there's a repetitive nature, right? We do one project, we execute it, we do another project, execute it. So, at a certain point, you're like 40 projects deep into this, and you know where the punchline of this joke's going to be. You can tell, but the client can't, because this is the first or second time they're doing it. So coach them along, bring them along. And the team isn't just the client and you, it's your consultants, it's the brokers are involved in a lot of this and have a lot of say, right? It's the contractor, if you're lucky enough to be able to have someone in the city that is working with you, that person's part of your team, right? So it really, I think at a certain point, it's our job to orchestrate things. So I start to think of us as like a orchestra leader, where you're, you can't take all the shine, right? Like, I'm telling that trumpet player what to do, but man, that guy's killing the trumpet. You know what I mean? Like that's him. I'm just with him. So I think about things that way. So I never try and shut people down or clients down when they propose something. It's more about, okay, that's an idea. We're going to think about that. And sometimes they're right. Sometimes when you actually think about it, it's like, man, that was great insight.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's, oh, geez, this person, this is horrible. Like we'll get them there. Don't worry. So again, kind of a long-winded way of saying, I think there's time, and I think our system allows us to bring people to what we think is the right answer, and what would actually end up being the right answer.
Yeah. One of the things I took away from almost every answer that you've given today is that you have a process by which things get done, and that assures that you deliver a great end product.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that you get to those places, or the way you're dealing with people throughout the process, is very individualized to them. So it's kind of this way of like, everyone is different, but everyone follows this same formula, so that even though you may all have different starting points, at the end of the day, we can still deliver the result, because the process stands despite the individualization of it.
Yeah.
which is interesting to me, because there's a lot of people who, it's fly by the seat of your pants. It's like, everything's a one-off. We'll take every detour you want to take with us, and at the end of the day, we'll make it right. We all know the chaos that ensues trying to deliver the project at the end of that.
Yeah.
Or there's the opposite, where you're so concerned with delivering the margin to the company that the process is too rigid for the customer to really get everything they need to out of it. right? I
Mhm.
think those are the two extremes of like where companies work, and it sounds like you found a good balance between those two.
Yeah, it's keep it fluid, but keep it moving, right? You
Yeah.
know, you can't I mean, listen, I think we're all creative people, but don't confuse us with being artists, right? Like I have a very high respect for artists and the creative process, and to me, like true art is leave that person alone. Just let them do what they do. Don't intervene. They have a vision. They're executing a vision. At a certain point, we in this field all made a decision that you know we're all creative artists, you know, designers. We're going, but we made a conscious decision to veer off into the business world, and you know people have to move in, right? Like they have deadlines. They have a company to run. So I don't mean this in a dismissive fashion. When I say the luxury, we don't have the luxury to just live in our own mental space. We're part of a team, right?
Yeah.
We have to bring everyone together and keep things moving. So we want to stay as creative as possible, but that framework that we work around is tried and true, and it's been there for a long time. So I'm not in the frame of mind to fix things that aren't broken, but I am going to bend them, you know,
Yeah.
so we can get as much out of them as possible.
That reminds me of something Seth Godin in one of his books said, you know, at some point you have to ship, right? Like if you're in business, at some point you have to ship it. Like you can't be stuck in the perfection of it.
Yeah,
Whereas an artist, it is their a personal reflection of who they are and how they see the world. Sometimes they'll work on a piece of art for years and it'll never be completely done to them,
right.
right? But you're right. Like when you're in business, at some point it has to ship. You
Yeah,
have to create a process by which you deliver a result to someone,
yeah.
and waiting for everything to be perfect isn't going to do that for sure.
I mean, if this last year has taught us anything, it is the importance and how instrumental running businesses are. You know, like
Mhm.
there's a lot of lives attached to this, right? There's a
Yeah.
lot of lives to making sure that these businesses run smoothly. Um, so I would feel, you know, again, like if I think about that path, uh, if I wanted that, I should have consciously made the decision to go the artist route and live in that world, but I didn't. I made the decision to go this route. So I have to respect that. I have to respect some of the boundaries that I've put myself into, and make sure that at the end of the day, people can still put food on their table. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? It's
That's
important.
awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I always end with this question. So I'll tell you a quick space real quick as an example, but I always end with this question of, you know, especially with you being so well traveled, you probably can think of a place. Can you think of a place where there was such a unique history or a unique, you know, story behind this specific place you were in, and you were just like, wow, you discovered it, but you're just like, wow, this is just like a huge missed opportunity to play this up. And I'll tell you the space that I think of every time I ask this question. Um, there's a place, I've only been to New York once, but there's a place in New York in the financial district, you know, down by Water Street and everything down there. It's not on the old cobblestone road, but it's kind of off the path a little bit. And it's a place called Francis Tavern. And it looks like this little two-story building in the middle of skyscrapers in New York, and it's got a little plaque on it that says it's a museum. But until you read it, unless you stopped and read the plaque, you wouldn't even realize what this building was. And what it is it's the tavern where George Washington said goodbye to the troops after they won the Revolutionary War. And it's
Mhm.
just sitting here on a corner, you know, between like a deli and a hotel. And I'm just sitting there like, wow, like how many people walk past this and don't know what happened in this spot? Like this is where he said, "Good job, men, you won your country, go home."
Uh-huh.
And I just think of like how many places have I been where I just walked by something that was so historic or had such a great story and I missed it. Can you
Uh-huh.
think of a place where you were and you were like, wow, this is just such a missed opportunity to tell a story around this space or this building?
Can I flip the script on you and tell
Yeah,
you a place that I think was done really well?
that's totally great. I love that.
So I'll go to New York too, and I always hate. Again, I'm competitive, right? Because
Yeah.
the business we live in. So I hate giving kudos to other architects just because I have to be petty, right?
Yeah.
But I'll tell you one that I think has done really well. And everyone knows this one, right? In New York, obviously the High Line to me is one of those projects that I just think it's just nailed across the board, right? Like it's one of those things where you think about it, it's like that was really smart. One, I think the way it links people from one point to the next and gives them like a elevated view of the city. You look at it, they didn't get too fussy with the design. They kept it feeling overgrown and like it feels lived in. It's felt lived in since day one. So I think it talks about the history of moving things through the city, but instead of doing it mechanically, you're now doing it with people. So I just think it's a very interesting, well done, well thought through, and diagrammatically one of the most simple concepts. Like not fussy at all. Everyone will get that. I could have walked my grandmother through that, and she would have been like, "Oh, this used to be tracks. They turned it into a park. This is kind of cool, right?" Like it doesn't. You don't need to be some snooty designer in a turtleneck to walk through and fully appreciate that project. And it's meant for the city, right? So there's just like so many boxes that have been checked on that thing. At this point, I'm sure it was probably a headache to get through the city and to like the financing of it, all of that stuff that we always tend to forget when things are done. But I just on a project basis, I think when I think of that one, it's like, yeah, that's well done. There's a
Yeah.
lot there.
I love that. I love that. I'm glad you flipped it on me because I like to hear places just for my own curiosity. That way I know where to go, and I feel bad that I didn't actually get to go there when I was there.
Oh, you did? Oh, yeah. It's they're developing around it. Like there's so many like off points that connect to important spots. Just it's smart. It's like a smart project that feels like it's stripped away any architectural pretension. Like there's no this is my move, this is how I design kind of deal. It is what it is. So it's the best kind of project. 20 years from now, 30 years from now, it's going to feel the same as it does now. It's a public space that was well executed.
Well, yeah, it leverages the natural interpretation of people as opposed to, like you said, it being somebody's fad. It's their signature, them trying to make a mark for themselves, which will always fade, right? It's very dependent on the artist or the kind of the zeitgeist of the time or whatever. But just breaking it down into something so simple, it can't really fade in the same way.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Well, awesome, man. Well, it's time flies when we're talking. It's been 30, 35 minutes. I really, really appreciate you jumping on with me and doing this. And if somebody's looking for Wolcott architecture or you, how would they find Wolcott?
Our website, wolcottai.com. If someone wants to email me, my last name's a long one, so I have a email address, carlos@wolcottai.com. I simplified it for everyone.
Oh, there you go. So nobody
so
has to guess on how to spell Carrasquillo.
Yeah, they always miss a letter somewhere along the line, and I never get emails. So Carlos is simple enough. So yeah, reach out. I'd love to interact with people.
Awesome, easy enough. Well, hey, thanks again for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Everybody, thanks for tuning in. If you have questions for Carlos, please connect with him. Connect with him on LinkedIn or go to wolcottai.com and do that. And we will see you guys next time.
All right.